The sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the well-maintained suburban streets. Officer Kevin Chen sat in his patrol car, sipping the last of his now-cold coffee while watching traffic flow past. It had been a quiet Friday evening, just the way he liked it. He'd given out a few warnings for minor infractions, mostly to teenagers playing their music too loud, but nothing serious had demanded his attention. That was about to change. As Chen watched the passing cars, a black SUV with tinted windows caught his eye. Something about it made him straighten in his seat. Maybe it was the way it moved slightly slower than the other vehicles, or how the windows seemed a shade darker than state regulations allowed. Without giving it much thought, he flipped on his patrol lights and pulled out onto the road. The SUV responded perfectly, signaling right and pulling over smoothly into a well-lit area near a shopping center. Chen noticed how the driver chose a spot right under a streetlight, something experienced people often did to ensure everyone felt safer during the stop. He radioed in his location and the vehicle's plates, then stepped out of his cruiser. Following standard procedure, Chen approached the SUV, hand resting near his belt. The street was quiet except for the occasional whoosh of passing cars and the clicking sound of his boots against the pavement. His flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, reflecting off the SUV's spotless black paint. "Evening," Chen called out, his voice carrying the authority he practiced over his 8 years on the force. "License and registration, please." The driver's window hummed as it lowered, revealing a well-dressed older man in a crisp blue suit. Chen's demeanor shifted subtly. Something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be a routine stop. "Is there a problem, officer?" the driver asked calmly, his hands visible on the steering wheel. Another sign this wasn't his first interaction with law enforcement. Chen's response came out harsher than he'd intended. "Your windows appear to be tinted beyond legal limits, sir. I'll need to see your license and registration." The man's calm expression never wavered as he said, "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's all right." Something about the man's measured tone made Chen uncomfortable. Usually, people were either nervous or angry during traffic stops. This man was neither. He watched as the driver slowly retrieved his documents, noting how deliberately he moved, almost as if he was following a script he knew by heart. "Here you are, officer," the man said, holding out 2 items, a driver's license and something else that caught the beam of Chen's flashlight and gleamed gold. Chen's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the second object. It wasn't just any badge. It was the badge of Police Chief Robert Williams, his boss's boss, the man who ran the entire Millbrook Police Department. The realization hit Chen like a bucket of cold water. He'd just pulled over the chief of police, and his approach had been far from professional. His mind raced back through the last few minutes, analyzing every word, every assumption he'd made based solely on what he'd seen through tinted windows. The chief's eyes met his, not with anger, but with something that made Chen's stomach twist even more: understanding. In that moment, Chen knew this encounter would change more than just his evening patrol. It would change everything. The night air suddenly felt heavier as both men realized this was only the beginning of a much longer conversation. Traffic continued to flow past them, drivers unaware that they were passing by a moment that would reshape the future of their local police department. Chief Williams stepped out of his SUV, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Officer Chen felt rooted to the spot, his flashlight beam now pointed at the ground. The chief's presence seemed to change the very air around them, making the routine traffic stop feel like a pivotal moment in time. "Walk with me, Officer Chen," the chief said, gesturing toward the empty sidewalk nearby. His voice carried no anger, no threat, just a gentle authority that made it impossible to refuse. The shopping center's lights created a soft glow around them as they moved away from their vehicles. Chen's throat felt dry. "Sir, I apologize. I didn't realize." The chief raised his hand, stopping Chen mid-sentence. "Let's talk about what happened back there. But first, tell me, What made you pull me over? The question hung in the air. Chen could have mentioned the tinted windows again, could have stuck to his official reason, but something about the chief's direct gaze made him dig deeper for the truth. Chen paused, searching for the right words. I saw the vehicle and made assumptions. The tinted windows were part of it, but if I'm being honest, I can't say for sure those windows are actually illegal. A small group of teenagers walked past, their laughter momentarily breaking the tension. The chief waited until they passed before speaking again. You know what impressed me most? He asked, surprising Chen with the question. You admitted that just now. That's not easy to do. Most people would have doubled down, defended their actions. But growth starts with honesty. Chen felt his shoulders relax slightly, though the knot in his stomach remained. The chief continued walking, hands clasped behind his back, like he was taking an evening stroll rather than addressing a serious situation. I've been in law enforcement for 28 years, the chief shared, his voice taking on a storyteller's rhythm. When I started, there were plenty of officers who wouldn't even look me in the eye. But there were also good men and women who taught me something valuable. Every traffic stop, every interaction, is a chance to either build or break trust with our community. A cool breeze rustled through nearby trees as they reached the end of the sidewalk. The chief turned to face Chen directly. What you're feeling right now, that discomfort, that realization, I want you to remember it. But I don't want it to shame you. I want it to change you. Chen found himself nodding, memories of other traffic stops flashing through his mind. How many times had he acted on similar assumptions? How many people had he treated differently without even realizing it? Sir, what happens now? Chen asked, dreading the answer but knowing he needed to hear it. The chief smiled slightly. That depends on you. I could write up a formal reprimand, make an example of this situation. Or, he paused, looking back toward their vehicles, we could use this moment to create real change, not just for you, but for the whole department. A passing car's headlights illuminated them briefly, reminding Chen that they were having this profound conversation on a regular Friday evening, in full view of the public they served. I want to do better, Chen said quietly, surprising himself with how much he meant it. I need to do better. Good, the chief replied, checking his watch. Because tomorrow morning, I'm starting a new training program, and I want you to help me lead it. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've just learned the lesson themselves. As they walked back toward their vehicles, Chen felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about avoiding a reprimand or saving face. This was about becoming the kind of officer he'd always wanted to be, the kind who served everyone in his community equally and fairly. The night was far from over, but its meaning had completely transformed. What had started as a routine traffic stop was becoming something much more significant. A chance for real change, not just for one officer, but for an entire department. Back in his patrol car, Officer Chen sat with his hands on the steering wheel, watching the chief's SUV disappear into the night. His radio crackled with routine chatter, but he barely heard it. His mind was replaying every moment of the conversation, every word that had just changed the course of his career. He pulled out his small notebook, the one every officer carries but few actually use. Tonight felt different. Tonight needed to be remembered. As he wrote down his thoughts, his phone buzzed with a text. It was his wife asking if he'd be home for dinner. He smiled, thinking about how much he had to tell her. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. Chen handled 2 noise complaints and helped a stranded motorist, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the chief's words. Every interaction is a chance to either build or break trust. He found himself paying more attention to how he spoke to people, noticing their reactions in a way he hadn't before. Around midnight, Chen pulled into the police station parking lot. The building looked different somehow, less like the familiar brick structure he'd worked in for years and more like a place of possibility. A few officers were gathered near the entrance, sharing their usual end-of-shift stories. "Hey, Chen," called Officer Thompson, a veteran cop with 15 years on the force. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Rough night." Chen hesitated. This was usually where officers shared their traffic stop stories, often with a touch of humor or frustration. But tonight's story felt too important for break room banter. "Actually," he said, "something happened tonight that I think we all need to hear about." The seriousness in his voice made his colleagues pause their conversations. Inside the break room, over cups of mediocre coffee, Chen shared his experience. He didn't just tell them about pulling over the chief. He told them about his assumptions, his realizations, and the chief's response that had turned a potentially career-damaging mistake into an opportunity for growth. "Wait," Officer Rodriguez interrupted. "He wants you to help lead a training program, after you profiled him." "That's exactly the point," Chen replied, surprising himself with his conviction. He saw something worth saving in that moment. He saw a chance to make real change, not just punish a mistake. The room fell quiet. These were good officers, Chen knew, but like him, they'd all developed habits and assumptions over the years. The chief's words echoed in his mind. "Growth starts with honesty." "You know what's crazy?" Chen continued, warming to his topic. "All those times we've had diversity training, all those seminars about bias, none of it hit home like tonight did. Because tonight, I wasn't just learning about it, I was living it." As his colleagues nodded and shared their own thoughts, Chen noticed the night shift supervisor watching from the doorway. She'd been listening quietly, and now she stepped forward. "The chief's right," she said. "This department needs this conversation, and it needs to come from one of our own who's been through it." Chen looked at his watch. His shift had ended 30 minutes ago. But instead of heading home, he pulled out his notebook again. If he was going to help lead this training tomorrow, he needed to get his thoughts in order. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about changing the way they all approached their jobs, their community, and each other. As he wrote, he could feel the energy in the room shifting. What had started as one officer's humbling experience was becoming something bigger, a spark of change that could transform their entire department. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in his career, Chen felt truly ready to face them. The night shift officers began filtering out, but not before several stopped to share their own stories, their own moments of realization. Chen listened, knowing that each conversation was a small step toward the change their department needed. The next morning arrived too quickly. Officer Chen stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his uniform for what felt like the 100th time. His wife watched from the doorway, holding a cup of coffee she'd made for him. "You've got this," she said, reading the nervousness on his face. "Just tell them the truth, like you told me last night." The drive to the station felt different. Chen noticed things he usually missed. The mom walking her kids to school, the elderly couple at the bus stop, the teenager hurrying to his morning shift at the local diner. These weren't just people in his patrol area anymore. They were his community. The training room was packed when he arrived. Officers from every shift had shown up, some even coming in on their day off. The chief stood at the front, talking quietly with the department's training coordinator. When he saw Chen, he smiled and waved him over. "Ready?" the chief asked, though it felt more like a statement than a question. Chen nodded, his throat tight. The room quieted as the chief stepped up to the podium. "Yesterday," the chief began, "something happened that could have gone very differently." He gestured for Chen to join him at the front. "Officer Chen here pulled me over." And instead of it becoming another statistic, another headline, it became a moment of truth. Chen looked out at his fellow officers. He saw curiosity in some faces, skepticism in others. Taking a deep breath, he started telling his story, not the polished version he practiced in his head, but the raw truth about his assumptions, his biases, and the moment everything changed. "I've given out hundreds of tickets," Chen said, his voice growing stronger. "But last night was the first time I really saw how much power we have in those moments. How one traffic stop can either build trust or break it." An officer in the back raised his hand. "But we can't just stop doing our jobs. There are real criminals out there." The chief nodded. You're right, which is why we're not here to tell you to stop doing your jobs. We're here to help you do them better. What followed was unlike any training session they'd had before. Officers shared their own stories. Times they'd made snap judgments, times they'd been wrong, and times they'd gotten it right. The room became a place of honest conversation rather than just another mandatory training. During the break, Officer Lee, a rookie just 6 months out of the academy, approached Chen. You know, I've been struggling with this, she admitted. Sometimes it feels like we have to choose between being effective and being fair. Chen thought about it. Yesterday, I would have agreed with you, but now I'm thinking maybe we're effective because we're fair, not in spite of it. As the morning went on, something shifted in the room. The initial tension melted into genuine discussion. Officers who rarely spoke up in trainings were sharing their thoughts. Even the most experienced veterans were taking notes. The chief wrapped up the session with a simple statement. What happened last night could have been a tragedy. Instead, it's becoming a turning point. But that only works if we all commit to making real change. As officers filed out of the room, many stopped to talk with Chen. Some shared similar experiences. Others asked questions about how to handle specific situations. It wasn't just about one training session anymore. It was about changing the culture of their entire department. Back at his desk later that morning, Chen found a note from the chief. This is just the beginning. Your honesty today will save lives tomorrow. He pinned the note to his bulletin board, right next to his family photos. Looking at it, he realized that his biggest mistake had somehow led to his most important contribution to the force. Sometimes, he thought, the best lessons come from our hardest moments. A week had passed since that life-changing traffic stop. Officer Chen sat in his patrol car, parked near the local high school as students streamed out after final bell. He watched them through different eyes now, not as potential troublemakers, but as kids heading home, each with their own stories. His radio crackled with a call about a suspicious person in the downtown shopping district. As Chen responded, he remembered how differently he would have handled this just a week ago. The description was vague. A young man in a hoodie, looking out of place near the upscale stores. When he arrived, Chen found exactly what the caller had described. But instead of immediately confronting the young man, he parked his car and watched for a moment. The suspicious person was actually looking at his phone, occasionally glancing up at store windows, probably waiting for someone. Chen approached on foot, keeping his body language open and friendly. Afternoon, he called out. Everything okay? The young man looked up, tension visible in his shoulders until he saw Chen smile. Yes, sir. Just waiting for my mom. She works at the salon next door. In the past, Chen might have demanded ID immediately, might have treated this like a potential crime in progress. Instead, they had a brief conversation. He learned the young man was a college student, home for the weekend to help his mom move to a new apartment. As Chen walked back to his car, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the chief, asking him to stop by the station when he had a chance. These check-ins had become regular over the past week, not as supervision but as genuine conversations about changing their approach to policing. At the station later that afternoon, Chen found not just the chief, but also a small group of community leaders in the conference room. The chief's face broke into a warm smile. Perfect timing, the chief said. We were just discussing the changes we've been implementing. Officer Chen here has been instrumental in our new training program. One of the visitors, a local pastor, leaned forward. We've noticed a difference already. People are talking about it in my congregation. How traffic stops feel different. How officers are taking time to listen. Chen felt a surge of pride, not just for himself, but for his fellow officers who had embraced the changes. The old way of doing things, quick judgments, aggressive approaches, was giving way to something more thoughtful, more human. Tell them about today, the chief encouraged. Chen shared the story of the suspicious person call, how he handled it differently, and what he learned from the experience. That young man went home with a story about a positive police interaction, Chen explained. And maybe next time he sees an officer, he won't feel that automatic tension. That's how we build trust, one interaction at a time. The meeting continued, with community leaders sharing their perspectives and suggestions. Chen took notes, realizing how rare it was to hear directly from the people they served about how their actions affected the community. As the meeting wrapped up, an elderly community leader stopped by Chen's chair. "You know," she said quietly, "I've lived here for 40 years. This is the first time I felt like real change might be possible." Walking back to his patrol car, Chen reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. The department's new approach was spreading, officer by officer, shift by shift. Even the most skeptical veterans were starting to see the benefits. Fewer complaints, more cooperative citizens, and a growing sense of connection with the community. His radio came to life again. Another call. Another chance to make a difference. As Chen pulled away from the station, he noticed a familiar black SUV in the parking lot. The chief's vehicle that had started it all. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, he thought, as long as we're willing to learn from them. 2 weeks after the traffic stop incident, Officer Chen found himself standing in front of a much larger audience. The neighboring city's police department had heard about their success and invited them to share their story. The conference room was packed with officers from 3 different counties. Chen tugged at his collar, still not quite comfortable with public speaking. But when he looked around the room, he saw faces filled with genuine interest. These weren't officers being forced to attend another boring training. They were here because they wanted to learn. "It started with a mistake," Chen began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "The kind of mistake many of us have made before, but this time it led to something different." As he spoke, he noticed an older officer in the front row, nodding along. The man's eyes showed understanding, the kind that comes from years of experience and probably similar realizations. "The easiest thing would have been to write me up," Chen continued. "Instead, our chief saw an opportunity to change not just one officer, but an entire department's approach to community policing." A hand shot up from the middle of the room. "But what about officer safety?" asked a sergeant from the county force. "We can't just let our guard down." Chen smiled, having expected this question. "Actually, we found the opposite. When we approach situations with respect and awareness instead of immediate suspicion, people respond differently. Our officers report feeling safer because the community trusts us more." He pulled up some statistics on the screen behind him. In just 2 weeks, their department had seen a 30% decrease in confrontational encounters during traffic stops. Civilian complaints had dropped significantly. And more importantly, community members were more willing to help with investigations. During the break, officers gathered around Chen in small groups, sharing their own experiences and challenges. One officer pulled him aside, speaking quietly. "Last month, I had a similar situation," the officer admitted. "Pulled over a car, made assumptions, and it turned out to be a state senator. But unlike your chief, he filed a complaint. Maybe if we'd handled it your way." Chen listened as more stories poured out. It seemed every department had similar experiences, but few had found a way to turn them into positive change. The chief, who had been watching from the back of the room, stepped forward to join the conversations. "The real test," the chief added, addressing the growing crowd, "isn't just changing how we act in the moment. It's changing how we think about our role in the community." As if to prove his point, Chen's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Thompson back at their station. She'd sent a photo of community members bringing coffee and donuts to the morning shift, with a note that read, "Thanks for making us feel heard." The afternoon session turned into an open forum, with officers from different departments sharing their experiences and brainstorming solutions. Chen watched as the initial skepticism gave way to genuine engagement. "You know what's really changing?" Chen asked the room. "It's not just our procedures or protocols. It's the stories people tell about us. Instead of warning their kids about police, parents are telling them we're here to help. That's real change. As the session wrapped up, the chief of the neighboring department approached them. "We want to implement something similar," he said. "Would you be willing to help us set it up?" On the drive back to their station, Chen and his chief talked about how far things had come. What started as a potentially career-ending traffic stop had grown into a movement that was spreading beyond their city limits. "You know what the best part is," the chief said, looking out at the sunset. "Every officer who heard your story today will go back to their department with a choice to make. And some of them will choose to be the change their community needs." 1 month after the traffic stop that changed everything, Officer Chen stood at the front of the police academy classroom. Looking at the fresh faces of future officers, he remembered sitting in those same seats, thinking he knew everything about being a good cop. "Your textbooks will teach you procedures," Chen began, scanning the room of attentive cadets. "But today, I want to talk about something that's not in any manual. The power of a single moment to change everything." A young cadet in the second row raised her hand. "Sir, we've had diversity training already." "How is this different?" Chen picked up a marker and walked to the whiteboard. "Let me tell you about a traffic stop that taught me more than 10 years of traditional training ever did." As he shared his story, the room grew quiet. These weren't just students taking notes anymore. They were future officers seeing a different way of doing things. Chen drew a simple diagram on the board. A circle with community on one side and police on the other, connected by the word trust. "See, we used to think our job was drawing a line between these two," he explained, "drawing a barrier. But really, he erased the line and drew connecting bridges. Our job is building bridges." A hand shot up from the back. "But what about when we have to make split-second decisions? We can't always take time to build bridges." "Actually," Chen replied, "that's exactly when this matters most. When you've built trust in your community, those split-second decisions become clearer because you're not fighting against years of mistrust." He shared stories from the past month, how their department had changed, how community members were now approaching officers to report crimes instead of avoiding them, how even routine traffic stops were becoming opportunities for positive interaction. During the break, a group of cadets gathered around his desk. One of them, a former military officer, seemed particularly moved. "You know," the cadet said quietly, "I joined the force because I wanted to serve my community like I serve my country. But I was worried it would be us versus them. This is different." Chen nodded, remembering his own journey. "A month ago, I would have told you our job was catching bad guys. Now I know it's about something bigger. It's about building a community where everyone feels protected, not just policed." Back at the front of the room, Chen played a video, body camera footage from recent interactions showing the new approach in action. Officers taking time to listen, explaining their actions, treating every person with respect regardless of circumstances. "Your badge isn't just a symbol of authority," Chen told them. "It's a promise to your community. And keeping that promise starts with seeing people as people, not as potential threats or statistics." A senior instructor who had been watching from the doorway stepped in. "You know," he said to the class, "in 20 years of training officers, I've never seen cadets this engaged. This is the future of policing." As the session wrapped up, cadets lined up to share their thoughts and ask questions. One conversation stuck with Chen. A quiet cadet who had barely spoken all day finally approached. "My dad's a cop in another city," she said. "He always told me to be tough, to never show weakness. But what you're teaching us, this isn't weakness, is it? It's actually a different kind of strength." Chen smiled, thinking about his own transformation. "The strongest thing we can do is admit when we need to change," he replied. "And the bravest thing we can do is lead that change." Looking out the academy window at the setting sun, Chen thought about how far they'd come. The lessons from that traffic stop weren't just changing their department anymore. They were shaping the next generation of officers, creating a ripple effect that would touch countless lives. 6 weeks after the traffic stop, Officer Chen walked into his local coffee shop and noticed something different. The usual morning customers, who once grew quiet when an officer entered, now offered friendly nods and smiles. The barista, who knew his order by heart, waved him over with excitement. "Have you seen the newspaper?" she asked, sliding a copy across the counter along with his coffee. There on the front page was a headline that made him pause. "Local police department becomes model for change." Chen sat at his usual corner table, reading about how their department's transformation had caught the attention of national law enforcement experts. The article mentioned the traffic stop, but focused more on what happened after. The ripple effect that had touched not just their city, but departments across the state. His phone buzzed with a text from the chief. "Channel 5 wants to interview us both. Ready to share our story with a bigger audience." Before Chen could reply, an elderly gentleman approached his table. "Officer," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something." He sat down, hands wrapped around his own coffee cup. "I've lived here for 40 years, the man continued. "Never trusted the police, taught my grandkids to be careful around officers. But last week, my grandson got pulled over by one of your officers. He came home talking about how respectful they were, how they explained everything. That's when I knew things were really changing." Chen listened, remembering how many similar conversations he'd had recently. Each one reminded him that what started as his mistake had grown into something much bigger than himself. Later that day at the television studio, Chen watched as the chief explained their new approach to the news anchor. The cameras felt intimidating, but the story they were telling was too important to keep quiet. "It's not just about changing policies," the chief was saying. "It's about changing hearts and minds, starting with our own." When it was Chen's turn to speak, he forgot about the cameras and spoke from his heart. "We're not just enforcing laws anymore," he explained. "We're building relationships. Every traffic stop, every call, every interaction is a chance to show our community that we're here to protect and serve everyone, equally and fairly." The interview was interrupted by breaking news. A major accident on the highway. Chen and the chief rushed to the scene, where their officers were already working. What struck Chen wasn't just how efficiently they handled the accident, but how the crowd of onlookers responded to their presence. Instead of staying back with phones raised to record potential mistakes, community members stepped forward to help. An off-duty nurse offered medical assistance, a truck driver helped direct traffic, and nearby residents brought water for everyone involved. "See that?" the chief said quietly, watching the scene unfold. "That's what trust looks like. That's what we've been building." Back at the station that evening, Chen found a stack of emails from police departments across the country, all asking about their training program. One message stood out, a thank you note from a rookie officer in a neighboring state who had watched their interview. "Your story made me rethink everything about why I became an officer," the note read. "Today, I handled a traffic stop differently because of what you shared. It changed everything." As Chen prepared to head home, he passed the spot where the chief had pulled him over 6 weeks ago. The street looked the same, but everything else had changed. What could have been the end of his career had become the beginning of something much more important. His radio crackled with another call, a routine noise complaint. But now, even routine calls felt different. Each one was a chance to reinforce the trust they'd built, to show their community that change wasn't just a headline. It was real, lasting, and growing stronger every day.